A monumental win. That's how President Trump described a pledge by NATO leaders to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP. His call for European members to take more responsibility for funding their own security dominated the alliance's short summit in The Hague, where leaders also expressed their ironclad commitment to defend one another if attacked.
NATO leaders' agreement to spend 5% of their GDP on defense by the year 2035 is one historic headline from this NATO summit, but it's only part of the reason European allies are feeling more secure now.
I watched the heads of these countries get up, and the love and the passion that they showed for their country was unbelievable. I've never seen quite anything like it. They want to protect their country, and they need the United States, as it's not a ripoff, and we're here to help them protect their country.
In addition to underscoring his commitment to NATO's all-important Article 5 collective defense, the U.S. president had warm words for his Ukrainian counterpart after a meeting which had been a source of much worry in advance that the two might clash, and a bonus for Zelenskyy and NATO.
Vladimir Putin really has to end that war.
While perhaps even more positive than NATO could have imagined, this outcome was not by chance, but the result of hardcore choreography. Trump got the royal treatment in The Hague, literally, the only leader to stay overnight in the Dutch king's palace. And he received so much adulation from NATO chief Mark Rutte that it became a summit talking point in itself.
Is this the way that you feel that you have to act when doing business with the US president, through flattery and praise? Isn't it a bit demeaning, and doesn't it make you look weak?
No, I don't think so. For example, when it comes to making more investments. I mean, would you ever think that this would be the result of this summit if he would not have been re-elected president?
And the flattery even extended beyond NATO business.
And when it comes to Iran, the fact that he took this decisive action, very targeted, to make sure that Iran would not be able to get its hands on a nuclear capability, I think he deserves all the praise.
Although some European leaders would have liked to see stronger language for Ukraine and against Russia.
So I am returning back to Lithuania relatively happy.
What signal does it send to the Kremlin, though? I mean, if they know you can't agree even to call Russia the
No,
aggressor?
I think it's bad news for them. The meeting, the declaration, and the general spirit at the table is bad news for them.
Once the summit euphoria wears off, there's hard work ahead, hard math, to ensure that this promised spending surge moves from paper to power. Spain and Slovakia have already said they're not on board, but those are battles the military alliance will fight another day.
A short while ago, I spoke with our correspondent Nick Conley in Kyiv. I asked him whether President Zelenskyy got what he wanted from the gathering, especially from his meeting with President Trump.
I mean, definitely seems like a change in tone from Donald Trump, more emphasis on what Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, needs to do, and more in the way of warmth and words of kind of fairly lukewarm support for Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Ukraine's leader. That is the kind of major takeaway. Obviously, this is still a long way away from where Ukraine would want to be, right? Ukraine wants to be on a clear pathway to joining the alliance. That is nowhere to be seen. We've seen people in the Trump administration basically saying that is never going to happen. So if you compare that to a NATO summit in Vilnius, say 2 years ago, where the Ukrainians, where Zelenskyy got a lot of also pushback from the Americans and the Germans for basically demanding a date of when Ukraine would join the alliance, we have come a very long way. But certainly compared to where they were, say, a couple of months ago after that disastrous run-in in the Oval Office between Zelenskyy and Trump, this is already a lot better and feels like a situation in which Ukraine can win and get more out of these negotiations with the Americans and the Europeans.
Let me ask you about the increase in defense spending that most countries, NATO member states, have agreed to. What does that mean, if anything, for Ukraine?
I think it means that Europe is going to create a defense base on a totally different kind of scale than has been in the case since the end of the Cold War, right? We've seen basically the first few years of this war only the US had the supplies, the stocks to really send stuff to Ukraine directly. Most European countries, after a couple of months, ran out of spares that they could willingly give up. Other countries decided basically to give up all their artillery, that in the case of Denmark, for instance, rather than make Ukraine wait. But there just wasn't any slack in the system. There wasn't any oversupply that could then be redirected this way. So this basically is about giving European defence contractors the certainty that the money is going to be there and to get them to invest in producing more. We've already seen some of that in the last few years, but this is on a totally different scale. Having said that, if you compare that to what Ukraine spends on defence, which is upwards of 25 or even 30% of GDP on defence right now, even 5% seems pretty modest.
Now, NATO countries are planning to ramp up their defense spending and capabilities over the next 10 years. That's a decade along. Largely, they're doing that to deter Russian aggression. What lessons, Nick, could they apply from what's being learned now in Ukraine?
I think from a Ukrainian perspective, obviously any country at war is going to be a lot quicker and a lot more nimble than European countries that are thinking about some future perspective. We've heard German military leaders talking about the fact they believe Russia could be a real threat to NATO countries in Europe by kind of 5 years' time, the end of this decade. But I think there is an appreciation here that things are getting faster. I think the Ukrainian experience shows you need more and you need cheaper. You need more just higher numbers of all these systems. You need them to be interoperable. We've seen European countries trying to help Ukraine, having basically a huge kind of what the Ukrainians call a zoo of different systems that aren't even interoperable, even though these are all NATO member states. We've seen the Ukrainians having to create so-called Frankenstein weapons, where they kind of basically put together bits of kit that aren't designed to go together and somehow hope to make use of them because there is nothing else. So it's also about just having drones on a huge scale, right? We're seeing most European armies still have very few drones. They have very expensive drones in small numbers, but they don't have the kind of millions of attack drones, the FPV drones that the Ukrainians have been using. So there's a real sense there that Europe basically needs to hurry up and catch up and also realize that this is not about producing 10, 20 beautiful kind of specimens of some very high-tech equipment that then won't have resupply, but to actually have the capacity to fight a war against a country like Russia that has these very, very deep stockpiles and the capacity with its allies in Iran and North Korea to resupply on a scale that kind of is still beyond anything that the Europeans have been able to do.
Nick, thank you very much. Our correspondent Nick Connolly there in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Well, let's get some more analysis now from Armida van Rij. She focuses on European security policy at the Chatham House International Affairs think tank in London. Armida, from a security perspective, what are your main takeaways from the NATO summit?
So first of all, as your colleague was just saying there, the increase in defense spending is historic and it is significant. And in addition to that, in the parallels of the NATO summit, there was also the second edition of the Defense Industry Summit, where they really agreed to focus on improving supply chains for equipment, which, as we know, is very, very important. Otherwise, you can't actually produce your kit. But really, my kind of main takeaway is that it was a summit of low ambition. The agenda was shortened. Ukraine was largely decoupled from the agenda, and all of that was done to avoid a public bust-up between President Trump and President Zelenskyy, which would have been bad, frankly, for all allies, but also for Ukraine. But it is slightly unfortunate because of the many security challenges that the alliance faces, including these huge issues about industrial production that we've heard about, increasing and upping support for Ukraine. So the ambition should have been much higher. But to try and show that NATO is united, these kind of alternative methods had to be found to ensure that it could be seen as a successful summit.
Now, NATO is a security alliance. President Trump has been somewhat cagey about the mutual defense clause for that alliance, however. NATO's Article 5, which basically says an attack on one member state is an attack on all. After this summit, should member states feel more confident that President Trump would be there for them in a crisis?
I think we need to take Trump on a day-to-day basis because he will flip-flop. And same with, the mood music out of The Hague yesterday was positive, but today President Trump may wake up and feel very differently. He has in the past tied the protection of Article 5 and the nuclear umbrella to whether or not a country spends what he wants them to spend on defense, which is, of course, hugely problematic and undermines trust within the alliance. He now, in The Hague, reaffirmed his commitment to Article 5. The summit communique is again quite clear on that, despite the uncertainty that Trump again brought about with regards to that when he was on his way to The Hague. But again, today, next week, in a few months' time, he may feel differently, which is why it is so important for allies to ramp up their production and ramp up their capabilities in the conventional space. Because ultimately, we've got an American president who isn't entirely reliable, and we never quite know where he stands on the security guarantee.
There will be a lot more money dedicated to NATO defense in the next decade. It's a monumental leap forward in terms of spending. How do you think that money should be spent? What's needed most for security of NATO member states?
So there are a range of different items that are needed, which I won't give you a shopping list, but really one of the key issues is ensuring that Europe can operate autonomously from the US. And luckily, that kind of shopping list of items that Europe needs to be able to do things without the US, but that Europe needs to do anyway, is largely the same. So we're talking about strategic enablers like air-to-air refueling, strategic airlift, military mobility, logistics, those kinds of issues. That's where Europe really has critical gaps. What we know from the NATO defense planning process, which basically identifies the capability gaps based on the regional plans that NATO developed a couple of years ago, is that Europe needs approximately 1/3 more capabilities to serve the NATO region. Sorry, Europe and Canada needs approximately 1/3 more capabilities to meet the NATO regional plans. But in practice, if we count for redundancies, that means about 50% more. So this is why this hike in defense spending is really needed. But the money's got to come from somewhere. It may be debt, but it may also be tax rises and cuts in spending elsewhere for countries. So it's really important to bring the public along with us so that they are aware of what the threat is and why this needs to be done in a number of really rather fiscally constrained countries.
Armida, thank you very much. That was Armida van Rij from Chatham House. Thank you very much.
Thanks.